Greetings. I'm Tom Elliott from the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University, and it's my honor to welcome you to the 9th session of the Sunoikisis Digital Cultural Heritage Fall 2017. Our presenters today are Rada Varga, who is joining us from Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj, Napoca, Romania, and Gabriel Bodard, who is at the Institute of Classical Studies in London, England. Today's topic is prosopography and linked person data, so we'll be building on some established course themes, including named entities and linked data, so you'll want to watch out for those. And since it's such a great topic, let's not waste any time getting started. If I'm correct, Rada is presenting first, so Rada, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Good evening, everybody. Just give me a second so that I can screen share. Okay. Good. The first part of today's presentation is about prosopographical sources. Of course, I'm not going to present a series of prosopographical sources per se, but I'm going to talk about how we refer to the sources, what can we ask the sources, and what answers will we get. But to start with the beginning, what is prosopography? We have a dictionary, a Merriam-Webster definition of prosopography as a study that identifies and relates a group of persons or characters within a particular historical or literary context. A more closer to our research areas definition was given in 2000 by Catherine Keats Rowan, as she speaks about historical prosopography and says that it is about what the analysis of the sum of data about many individuals can tell us about the different types of connections between them, and hence about how they operated within and upon the institutions of their time. So prosopography is about people, but not only about people as biographical entities, but about the connections between them and the impact they had on various institutions or aspects of their time. Historical prosopography, regardless the historical age it is concerned with, operates more or less within the same methodological and theoretical frameworks. More or less because what differs are the sources. They differ in quantity and in quality, of course. In quantity, I think it is rather clear. For the ancient period, we have less sources than we have for the 20th century. This is obvious. By quality, I mean not only the nature of the information given by a certain source or a complex of sources, but as well the quantity of information. So, parish register from 17th century France, let's say, will be very different in quality and quantity of information from a honorific inscription from Roman Hispania. Now that we have established what prosopography and what historical prosopography is, let's see what prosopography is not and how going down the sources or up the line they describe, we get to prosopographical research. We have, of course, demography, which is the statistical study of human populations, especially with reference to size and density distribution and vital statistics. Historical demography deals with dimensions of populations, with life expectancies, with fertility, with migration phenomena, etc. Everything at a scale. We do not research the demography of a group of 4 people. We research the demography of a population. So we know that the Roman Empire had like around 80 million inhabitants at a time. Rome at its peak had around 1 million inhabitants. But this data, this very hard data, we do not know them from Roman sources. We do not have Roman censuses to cover large areas. We do not have Roman censuses like the Chinese census of the Han Dynasty to cover the whole population of the empire. We have a couple of censuses from Egypt, which are very comprehensive. We have some data from other areas of the empire, but from what we know, the Romans only made these registrations of the whole population for a given area, a city, a province, never for their whole empire. So how can we know how many people lived in a certain province of the empire at a given time? The same situation if we refer to classical Greece or something like that, or other Mediterranean civilization. We know this data because we can make density estimations and because we can make parallels with pre-industrial Europe. Without going in too much details, this is more or less how we get to demographical data. But as I said, in this case, we analyze the sources indirectly. The sources, the written source, the written ancient source, gives us, along with other information, a series of names, people's names. And so we get to the study of these names, and this is onomastics. This is not prosopography yet. Onomastics is the science or study of the origin and forms of proper names of persons or places. When we see a name, we can know certain things about it, or we can deduce, or we have been taught certain things about it. Generally, we can pinpoint the etymology of the name. We can say that a name is Hebrew or Greek or Roman. This doesn't have to lead us into error, because this doesn't mean that the ethnicity of the person bearing that name coincides with the etymology. They can be the same, but they can be different as well. We have to keep in mind examples that we have from our contemporary society. A name is not necessarily ethnicity. A name can be subject to fashion, to various influences, to many things. Then again, a name generally can tell us something about the gender of a person. We can also know about a name that it was popular or it was in use during a certain period of time in a certain area. This as well has to be well related to the source from which we know that name, because otherwise it can be misleading. For example, we have Marcus, which is obviously a Roman name, but it is a name which is used in many European languages nowadays as well. And of course, there are many examples, Alexander, and many examples of this sort. Okay, so we have the names, but a name was used by thousands, millions of persons. Depends on the name, obviously. What we need to do with these names is disambiguate them and connect the name to the person. This is the next level. But yet again, not every source which disambiguates and which labels a person with a name is a prosopography. It can be a source a secondary source for us to use in prosopographical studies, but it's not necessarily a prosopography. So we have persons catalogs or databases which disambiguate. We have like the Perseus catalog or various databases with library databases and catalogs. They disambiguate. They tell us that the name entities we see there are persons, but they do not give us biographical information. In order to do what the definition of prosopography says we should do, so connect a person with other persons and see the role he or she had in certain contexts or in relationship with certain institutions, we have to also know some biographical information, of course. Otherwise, it would be rather impossible to establish connections and to make sense of the larger picture. After this very theoretical presentation, I am going to show you some prosopographies we generally use for the ancient world, for the classical world, more or less. And I'm not going to go very deep into the structure of these databases. Some of them are online, some of them aren't, but I will present their relationship to the sources and what we should know about them when we are trying to use them in research. So the first one is PIR, Prosopographia Imperii Romani. This is a prosopography of the Roman imperial elites. It is a very old and very well-established prosopography. It also has an online interface, a database. Not everything from the print books are online yet, but we assume they will be at some point. And here is, I didn't want to go online for this first part of the presentation in order to minimize the risk of technical problems. So here I've searched for Saturninus, it's a name, and we have a list of Saturnini. And I've clicked the first one, and this is what we get. So we get, this is the PIR citation form. If we wanna use the citation as if we've seen it in the print book. In the printed book, we have the bibliography, and we have a little biographical note, let's say, about the individual, some relationships, and a relationship, and dating. And this is the structure for all of the voices in PIR. Now, the problem is that besides being a very, very useful research instrument for the Roman imperial world, it relates to the sources. Sometimes it quotes the primary sources, so the ancient texts and the inscriptions. Other times it doesn't, as it is this case. And I think this is a problem, because you have to go to this secondary source if you wanna see the primary source yourself. As well, as you can see, none of the information is linked to anything. So the online form basically is the book online. It doesn't do much more. The main advantage being that you have it a click away. For the Greek names, probably the most used lexicon is the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names. The title, the name, would suggest that it only refers to name, that it's more to names, sorry, that it's more of an onomasticon. But actually, they also disambiguate. I've chosen more rare names so that we don't see a million entries. They also disambiguate. We have the attestations of the name, connected to persons. So we have the sources where we can find. We have some dating, the places, sex, etc. Another traditional prosopography. By traditional in this context, I not only mean I don't mean necessarily in print, as you have already seen. They are traditional as well because you cannot research matters related to people from a certain period without relating, without quoting, without referring to one of them, at least. This is the Prosopography Chrétienne du Bas-Empire. Unfortunately, this one, as far as I know, at least, doesn't have an online interface. And this is the screen, this is a print from the book. So we have the name Abus. We have an Abus who was an episcopus, so bishop. We have another Flavius Abus Domesticus, and we have here a little biographical note. We have here some interpretations, some biographical details, some dating. And the last one, I think is the last one, is the Prosopography of the Byzantine world. This is an online database, and it looks more or less like this. So here I have looked for Procopius. Here are all the attestations of people named Procopius registered in their database. I clicked one of them, and here we see this Procopius, Manumitis slave of Cale Pocuriane. And we have some details on the individual and on the source mentioning him. I think that what was important from this presentation of traditional prosopographies is the fact that we have to know what, and it will be important in the second part of my presentation as well, we have to know where to look for certain information. If we are looking in this prosopography for a Roman senator from the Augustan period, we will not find him, obviously. As well, we have to know the structure of these databases or of these tools, and know what they can give us, and for what other informations we have to go somewhere else. And so we get to the second part of our presentation, the prosopographical data formats, which will go much deeper into the structure of the prosopographical instruments. Gabby, please.
Great, thank you, Rada. I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, so I'm going to talk, I'm maybe not going to go a lot deeper into the data, but I'll go a little bit into the data. Can you all see my slides now?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. So yes, I'm going to talk about these these 5 main headings. I'm going to talk very briefly about the data models and structure behind some of the classic prosopographies that Rada's just talked about. I'll talk a little bit about one model for encoding digital prosopography, or encoding prosopography digitally, should we say, which is the Factoid model. I'll talk about a couple of other ways in which we have we may have access to producing prosopographical data or ingesting prosopographical data that we may want to use ourselves, that is to say TI-XML and flat file database, spreadsheet, comma separated values data. And then a little bit later, after Rada's given some a couple of demonstrations of a couple of prosopographical databases, I'll come back and I'll talk about the 5th way of encoding and modeling person data digitally, which is using RDF, using linked open data, and I'll use the example of the Snapdragon database to have a look at that, and we'll have a look at how you would query that data, but I'll talk a bit more about that a little bit later. So to start with, I'll start the same place that that Rada started with, the Prosopographia Imperii Romani, and as she said, there is this print tool which is in multiple volumes. I forget exactly, it's 8 or so volumes now, where each entry, it has a unique identifier in the margin there. It's unique per letter, so this will be entry number R100 for Rossius, and it has various information embedded in there, but it's not structured in any particular way. The information is also given in Latin, which the idea being that's not a problem for any classicist, but it's maybe not the most user-friendly way to incorporate this sort of material. So you can see there is various information in there. There is some date information. There are cross references to other person entries. There are citations of primary sources and so forth embedded in there. And likewise, the digital version gives you some of this same information as well. So this is not really structured data, except in as much as you could, you could present it in a page with headings separating some of the values, but it's not structured in the sense of a database. It's pretty hard to search for this. Find me 2-digit numbers only when they refer to dates, right? Because C99 is not a date, Annie 69 is a date. So those sorts of things are the things that structure would give us on this. Again, using another of the examples that we've seen already, the Prosopography chrétienne, we have a slightly more structured entry. We can see that the date is in a separate field off to the right. There's some titulature in the main body of the text, but separated off typographically, and there are the primary references are given at the bottom there as footnotes. So it's slightly more structured information. This is still print, but the scope for digitizing this and making a searchable resource out of this is visually obvious from the way they present the layout. The Lexicon of Greek Personal Names. This is traditionally a print publication. Rada showed you the digital version of this, but it's also a print publication. It's in many volumes as well. And if you look under the name Xenon in this print publication, you will see entries for many persons, all sort of clumped together in these paragraphs and grouped together by the place in which this person is known, is attested. And so you can see many references to Xenon from Aphrodisias here. And it may not look very structured, but this actually is very structured data. It was very easy to turn this print data into the digital data that Rada showed you, that looked something like this, because the data is always in the same order. We have the person's name, we have the person's place of origin, where that's a single place of origin that we can record. We have some floruit information, date information. We have the primary or secondary references in which these this person is attested, and we sometimes have relationships with other persons given in here as well. And the volume information and the publication ID and the unique identifier of the person are all there in the data. They're not printed in the book because you don't need to print that this is from volume 5B when the entire book is volume 5B. But you see the number there, the number 3 before the under Aphrodisias, the third Xenon mentioned in here. That is Xenon 5B3. So it has a unique identifier that is extractable from that data, and it's all encoded in this data. This is a site which it's not surprising to learn that the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names has been a digital project since the 1970s when it started. So it always has had its data in this very highly structured form. And this is just an example of another structured prosopography, which gives you, again, the same sorts of information as you can get from some of the previous ones. This is born digital, and this is the prosopography that you get by looking at the index of attested persons in the ancient inscriptions of the Northern Black Sea project. And you can see for each one, we have a name, we have date information, we have relationships with other persons, we sometimes have titulature, and we have links back to the primary sources. In this case, the primary source is an inscription in this corpus, but there may be other primary sources known to these people. So I wanted to come on then. So those are all what I would call classic prosopographies, traditional prosopographies. And most prosopographies that were digitized, even if they were put in databases, and even if they were very, very structured and very useful digital, were more or less classic prosopographies in the same sense. They were structured information, but it was the same sort of information that you would get in print. The big innovation in how we digitize prosopography, or one of the innovations, is a model called the factoid model, which was a term was coined in the early 2000s, but I think had started being used possibly as early as the late 90s. Which, you know, a team including John Bradley, who still publishes on this subject, and others in the past, which structures prosopography in a relational database where the core of that database, the table that links all of the other tables in this relational database, are the sources and the statements in those sources. So how do we know various pieces of information about a person, about a place, about an event? And these statements in sources, and they call them factoids, which is not a terribly transparent name, but the point being that they're not just facts, because some of them are counterfactual, some of them are even internally inconsistent and contradict each other. But they're statements that purport to be fact in some sense, which, so, you know, we might have one particular inscription describing the marriage of a couple, and that therefore is a core factoid in this model, and related to this factoid are the two people who partook of that marriage and whose status was changed as a result of it. The relationship they have with each other stems from that factoid, and the place in which that took place, and other people who may be involved in it. All of these things are things which then link to this factoid. So the factoid is the center of a web of other kinds of information. And you can then browse this by looking at a person and seeing all of the different claims that have been made about them, some of which may, as I said, be internally contradictory or counterfactual, but we can see them as that context. And as you saw from the Prosopography of the Byzantine world example that Rada showed you before, you can browse, you can filter, you can navigate across the data set by following these links between persons and then the claims, which also relate to other persons, to places, to events, and to other kinds of information. So everything we know about a person is from a source. It's through a factoid. The fact, you know, their name is attested in a source. Their title, their role, their age, their dates, any kind of information we might have on a person is attested through some kinds of sources of this kind. Obviously, a relational database like this requires a lot of normalization and a lot of the use of controlled vocabularies and authorities in order to make this sort of linking and relationships within the database work. But that's how the factoid model works. And so here again is a screenshot from the Prosopography of the Byzantine world. There's a newer version of this website on, actually, since I made this screenshot, that now exists. And you can see that for this person, Leon Diabatenos, we have 6 kinds of information about this person, each of which is attested in multiple sources. So the narrative things we know, things that happened in this person's life, we have these 4 different sources for things that happened in Leon's life. And we have 5 different sources that tell us about offices or dignities that Leon Diabatenos held, and so forth. There are many other prosopographies that use this factoid model. Among them, the Prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England is one of the more prominent and successful ones. It's been running for several years and has had several instances attached to it, including the Doomsday database, but also others such as the database of the clergy of the Church of England, and the digitized prosopography of the Roman Republic that also use this sort of model. So this is a quite widely used model. So that's an example of a kind of prosopography which you couldn't really do without a computer. This is something that is truly a digital prosopography. Another kind of prosopography I want to talk about just briefly, or another way of structuring the data of prosopography, is with the using TI-XML, and we've talked about TI a little bit before in this course. But among the other things that the TEI does is it offers a module for encoding persons, and it's called the Personography module, which is kind of a terrible name. But they didn't want to say prosopography because people either don't know what it means or can't pronounce it. And in any case, personography has many sort of other possible applications that are not strictly speaking prosopography of the kind we're talking about. Someone who really talks about prosopography in the technical sense would probably say that the lexicon of personal names is not prosopography, because although it does disambiguate persons, it doesn't give biographical information about them. And many of the other sorts of data sets that we can encode using the TEI wouldn't necessarily be prosopographies. So any sort of person authority list, such as a library catalogue, wouldn't be a prosopography in this sense. But so the TEI have defined a bunch of elements specifically for encoding information about persons. Excuse me. And here's an example of one person entry potentially in a TEI personography list. So the person has an identifier, the person has a name, which may be a long string of information. The person has place information associated with them, the person has date information associated with them, and so forth. This is an example from the TEI guidelines. So it's very simple. It's just to show you how you might use the person element and some of the elements that appear in it. But a much richer example taken from a database that I put together is here. This is from a database of the 20th Legion, taken from Malone's publication of this. Shows all the various other kinds of things you can say about a person in TEI XML. And these are exactly, I won't go through them all, but these are exactly the same things that you would expect to see said about a person in any prosopography. So name, date information, place information, occupation and titles, the primary sources associating to this person, other identifiers, relationships with other persons, all these sorts of things that one might expect to talk about. I think this is a slide just showing the same one, just in slightly larger print, because I know YouTube sometimes shrinks this down, but there's the second half of it. So it shows the bibliography information and something which is quite useful for digital resources, of course, is particularly identifiers of this person in other databases. Knowing the Wikipedia URL for this person is valuable, not because we think we'll find useful information about this person in Wikipedia necessarily. You may never cite Wikipedia because you think it's useless and unreliable. But even still, the entry for Marcus Roscius Coelius is a useful disambiguating string because it can only ever refer to this person. So that's a useful kind of information one can encode in there. And then, as I mentioned, relationships. That person who I was talking about didn't have relationships, so I've taken some relationships from another person in the same data set. This is a person who has 3 slaves named in the data sources, and so you say each slave has a X is a slave of Y relationship, and the person, the owner, the master, has a Y is the master of X1, X2, and X3 a relationship. So to that, you of course don't have to record things in both directions because that's redundant, but you might want to. And then the final example I want to give is that you can of course record that sort of relatively flat prosopographical information in a fairly flat form database. And so in this case, even in a spreadsheet. So this is just literally using a Google spreadsheet to show prosopographical information about the first half dozen people in this Legion 20 data set that we're talking about. And so it simply has a column for various types of information, and this information can be transformed, it can be used to visualize, and processed in various ways that we've seen already in this module, particularly if there's place information in there, you could take this place affiliation information and turn that into coordinate information and potentially map these people and potentially visualize that map based on the date information associated with it and so forth. And one of the ways in which we process that information is by turning the spreadsheet into CSV, turning the database into CSV, so that we can transform it using regular expressions, so that we can take the data and upload it to visualization tools and so forth. That was where I wanted to stop, yes, because I will talk about Snapdragon a little bit later. So I'll hand back over to Rada now, who's going to give a demonstration of a couple of prosopographical databases, including one we haven't talked about yet, although it is quite important. Well, two that are both quite important. And we'll come back to looking at RDF a little bit later.
Thank you, Gabby. I will screen share. Okay, so I will try to present you now a demonstration of. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Am I screen sharing properly? Do you see Trismegistos, people?
Yes, we do.
Okay, good. I will show you two online platforms in different stages of development and dealing with very different sources, namely Trismegistos people and Romans 1 by 1. So this is Trismegistos people, which, as they say in the disclaimer, is not really a prosopographical database yet, but more of an onomastical one. But it is very, very useful for prosopographical research nonetheless, and they are beginning to develop their prosopographical component in the database. What's important to know is that Trismegistos deals with people attested in Egypt during the period 800 BC and 800 AD. As I said before, it is very important to know with what data sets and with what sources any tool that we are using deals with. They have two different components, search for names and search for people. Well, more different components, but these are the ones we are going to focus on. As well, we have a list of all names, but we don't want that. That can be useful as well if you really want to browse the name like this. So let's go for search for names first, because this component is much more developed than the other one. And let's look for a name. I have no idea. Just a name. So here we have the name. We can look for the name, and as you have seen, we have a couple of options. This is nice. As well, we can, for a more advanced search, we can fill in one or more of these fields: language, divine elements, grammatical type. Let's for now just look for a name and see what we get. We get restitutus. Latin variant of. We have the Trismegistos identifier, the name, the Greek form. Egyptian is not the case, the Latin form. If we click on it, this is the interesting part. We have all these details about the name. In this case, we don't have bibliography. Generally, we have that. And we have 11 attestations of the name. 11 types as a main name. We will immediately look for another one as well, which is maybe a more frequent one. And here we have very interesting attestation by century. So we have this graph. And if this relative count, so the percentages, doesn't tell us too much, we have here the number of texts. And we also have the attestations by provenance, which is again very useful, of course. Well, we see that this name comes from the Eastern Desert almost exclusively. We also have this attestation at Fayum. Okay. And we have a graphical representation. We have a network representation for the names, for all the names. Okay, so maybe let's change this example because let's go for a more common name so that we will have more features. Okay, so here, as you see, we have 222 attestations, 5 times as second name prefix. And if we want to see this, we can go and we have a list with text, name, person ID, the identifier, dating, the place, and in some cases, we can see the full text from papyri.info. As well, one time as double name, and we can see here the details on this. And here is the visualization. So we have a network visualization for the names. In this network doesn't visualize people, but names, the connection of names. So we have a father who named his son Alexandros. Here should be Titus, yes. And the colors represent the etymology of the different names. As we can see here, it has 17 connections. So it has, we can see a network for a network for a more frequent name as well, Alexandros. Yes. As we can see here, Alexandros has a degree of 297, obviously. It was a very, very popular name. The name size is given by the degree of the name, and the color, as I said, but by the etymology. Okay, this is the onomastical feature of Trismegistos people. Now let's search for people. We have more search options. We can search for a name, which can be the exact name or part of a name. And we can add, if there is the case, one or more of these fields: the father's name, the mother's name, the Prosopographica Ptolemaica number, in case we know it, and the period, the centuries when the name was attested. Generally, if we have a Prosopographia Ptolemaica number, we are looking for a specific name, for a specific person. If we are looking for, we have this autofill, which is nice as well. If we are looking for Marcus from the 3rd century, let's say, then we are not looking for a specific person. We just want all the persons named Marcus from the attested during the 3rd century. And we have 40 results. And in each case, we have the name, the father, we only have this father and maybe one here. The mother, it's not the case, the place, but we don't have the places, the date, and the number of attestations. Let's go to somebody with more than one attestation, with 2 attestations. And we have these details on the man, as you can see. This is all we know. And these are entries for the attestations. If we click on them, we get the text of the source as well, the whole text, and everything else that you can see here. Okay. Let's see a person who has some relationships as well, because I want to show that as well. Let's look for. Okay. I went here because I knew here that we will find more relationships. So we have name, father, mother, sex, ethnic, function, which doesn't exist yet, number in Prosopography Ptolemaica, provenance, dating, and parent of 6 persons. And if we click on this, we get the personal files of all his daughters and sons. And if we click on each one, we get all the information from the above. And here again, we go to the source files. Well, this link didn't work for the text, but it doesn't matter. And in the cases where more family details are available, we have them, as you can see. We have a spouse in this case, and other relationships if we know them. Okay. So this is Trismegistos people. Now we will go to Romans one by one. The graphics of the website still needs a bit of a haircut, but hopefully it will get it soon. Here we have listed all the people attested epigraphically in the Roman provinces of Dacia and Mercia, Inferior and Superior. So the languages are generally Latin and Greek. There are a couple of inscriptions in Semitic languages as well, but they are definitely a minority.
Could you zoom in a little bit, Rada?
Zoom in.
Make the text larger.
Okay, I'm trying.
Okay.
Is this okay? Can you see it?
Yep, that looks great. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Unfortunately, you won't see the whole page now. I think I will have to...
Okay, zoom a little bit less, yeah.
Is this... Do you see anything?
It's a little bit better, yeah, thank you.
Okay. I could zoom in a bit more, maybe. Yeah, okay. So let's look for someone. We have a lot of search filters. This is the person ID. Well, as in the case of Trismegistos, if you know a personal ID, so you know exactly the person you are looking for, but maybe, and generally it is not the case, obviously. So let's look for the same name as before, Marcus. Well, we obviously have we have 253 Marcuses. That's a very common name as a pronomen, as a Roman pronomen, but we could look for it as a personal name, and then we will only have 23 people. That's a bit better. Let's go to a personal file. Okay, this is a nice one. We also have relationships. So we have the unique identifier of the person, which you can also find in the URI, the personal name, and the name of the father or master. We have the gender, the fact that the inscription is dedicated for this character, the links for the inscription. Here we have a link to the inside file of the inscription, where you have some data on the type of monument, material, language, place of discovery, obviously dating, and bibliography. If you don't want to go to that file, you can go directly to an external source. Unfortunately, here you won't find the picture. You won't find the picture. In other cases, when we also have the inscription on EDH, or we link it there, so you sometimes also get a picture. And here we have the relationships of the person. He is the brother of Cocceius Januarius and the son of Cocceius Marcinus. if we want to find out some things about the people he was related with, we can link on their identifiers, and we see their personal files. As you can see, the types of information differ because here you cannot see the fields which haven't been filled in. So for each person, you only see the filled in fields. We know here the age because it's a funerary monument dedicated for him. And he was the brother of our Marcus and the son of the same father. As well, we can search for details for people attested on certain types of inscriptions. Sorry, for example, I don't know. People attested on funerary monuments. I'm just giving an example. We have 157 people. If this is okay for statistics or for more general researches generally. As well, we can look for relationships if we want to see all patrons from Dacia. I don't know. We will get this. And here we can we have the person, the first person with the identifier, and the second person is a patronus of the second person with the identifier, and the place of provenience. Okay, I think this is it. Gabby?
Yep, thank you. Great, yeah, so that's useful. So those are two sites that people might look at, and they can explore to get prosopographical information themselves directly by just searching the websites. What I'm going to show now is a site which has a slightly larger scale of personal data, less richness of information than either of the sites that Rada has just shown, but that intends to be many times, many orders of magnitude larger. In fact, not many orders of magnitude, but many times larger in scale. So are you seeing my slides now?
Yes.
Oh, great, thanks. And so this is the Snapdragon site. So this is standards for networking ancient prosopographies, which we may have mentioned before in passing. But this site is an in-progress project which began a couple of years ago, funded under a big data scheme, although classical prosopography is not what people who talk about big data in the digital humanities and in data science normally think of as big. In fact, it's very, very small by big data standards. Big data is supposed to be something that's too big to put on any one machine or to process on any one machine, or too complex. Whereas prosopography, we probably don't have prosopographical information for more than about 1 million people from the ancient world, which, you know, is a database that we could very easily handle even in something like Microsoft Access if we wanted to. So it's not really big data in that sense. But because the data, as we've seen so far, is divided between many, many different prosopographical resources in many different formats and with different richness of information, different granularity of information, aggregating that information in the way that we might want to if we wanted to do cross-searching, and identifying co-references between both primary sources and secondary data sets, and exploiting relationships between these data sets does then become very, very complex. So big data methods then become useful to this. So we're using linked open data to join together several data sets. And as a preliminary test, we've taken the entire list of names from the Lexicon of Greek personal names, which was some 300,000 entries. We've taken the Trismegistos people table, which was again another just over 300,000 people, and we have taken the names from a linked data extraction from the PIR website. So this is not the data from PIR itself, but data that someone else, in fact, Tom, our esteemed chair, extracted from the PIR website and turned into RDF. We've taken the 1,000 or so names from the Virtual Internet Authority file, which is an aggregation of library catalogs, who are people from before 1000 CE, so most of them are classical authors, and we've taken a selection of ancient people from the British Museum's person catalogue, a person table in their database there, who are often, you know, sculptors, artists, etc. So it has these 5 data sets, 2 very large, 3 relatively small, and it's attempted to aggregate them in a single data format. What Snapdragon does, just very quickly for context, is it makes a set of recommendations. So as well as attempting to aggregate this person data, it makes a set of recommendations for people who are dealing with prosopographical or person data in digital form, for how they might structure their data, or how they might expose a version of their data if they want to contribute to this network, to this SNAP network of ancient and historical person data sets. So these are range from as simply as if you want to plug your prosopographical data into a large network, at the bare minimum, you have to put that information online. The individual persons have to have uniform resource identifiers. These have to be stable and persistent, and they have to be unambiguous. You know, all of which is fairly obvious. If you want us to be able to link to your database, the URL, the address that we follow to find Julius Caesar in your database must never change, right? Because otherwise that breaks everything. Second, we have a bunch of recommendations for how to encode the subset of your person data that you're going to contribute to the SNAP data set in RDF, and I'll come back to that because that's the important one. We have recommendations on how to identify co-references between data sets. We have recommendations for how to then make assertions about the data. This is slightly stronger than identifying co-references. Identifying co-references is when 2 data sets both refer to Julius Caesar and they have the same bibliography. And there's no doubt in anyone's mind that these are 2 data sets that refer to the same person. So, you know, we don't need to be to say, you know, I believe these are the same person. Making assertions is a much more scholarly activity where a person by the name of Marcus appears on a coin, and another person by the name of Marcus appears on an inscription from the same region of roughly the same date, and we have evidence to believe that they could be the same person, or that one could be the grandfather of the other, and therefore you make a scholarly assertion that this is the case, and you defend this with bibliographical citations, etc. And this is a much more complex thing than simply saying, you know, we can link these 2 fields from 2 different databases because they refer to the same person. And finally, we offer guidelines for how to annotate texts with person identifiers. And if you think back to a few weeks ago when we talked about Pelagios and how Recogito implements the Pelagios recommendations for how to annotate texts with place IDs, the Snapdragon recommendations are identical. They were in fact developed in tandem. We've been working with Pelagios for many years on these recommendations, and so they're in line with each other. So when we talk about recording person data in RDF, we're talking about recording a very small subset of person data. These are the 9 pieces of information that we want to encourage people to record in RDF in order to contribute to this large data set. Obviously, by limiting it to this small subset of data, we're making the data much less rich, but we're also making it much easier for us to find commonalities between the data. So if we were to encode a lot of the complex Byzantine and ecclesiastical relationship information that something like the Prosopography of the Byzantine world has for their persons, that would be very powerful. but the vast majority of other data sets, such as PIR, lexicography, personal names, and so forth, wouldn't have that sort of information, and so this information would sort of float there and wouldn't contribute to the interoperability between the data sets, and it's interoperability that we're interested in. So all of this is information that helps us to link between data sets, and that helps us to potentially disambiguate a certain person record compared to all the other person records with the same name or with other attributes in common. And so for a sample of data, here's what you might get for one person. This is SNAP number 650,000. The sort of information you might have about this person taken directly from the lexicography personal name. So we know all this information already. All this is doing is repeating what the lexicography personal names tells us about the person. And this is exactly what Snap does. It takes that information and it encodes it in RDF so that it can be queried side by side with all this other information about people on there. What I want to do now is just to show you how we recommend you use the Snapdragon data set to query and use look for person information. This is made more complicated than it is in the case of the data sets that Rada has just shown you, by the fact that there isn't a nice user-friendly interface for Snapdragon. And there's a very simple reason for that, and I've said it already. This is a project that's in progress. It was funded. The pilot project was funded a couple of years ago. It hasn't been funded since, and so it is currently sitting in between funding phases. And the search interface and the user-friendly browser interface hasn't been built yet. But also because linked data is slightly harder to work with than databases. It's a less mature technology, although it is a mature technology. It's been around for many years and it's very widely used. A database, we can all plug a database into our desktop and start using it straight away. If you have Microsoft Access or FileMaker or MySQL or whatever database you might be using, and we could all quite quickly learn how to use that. Getting something in a RDF triple store and querying it using Sparkle is something that's slightly harder. We have 3 weeks ago we already saw some Sparkle. You did some exercises on using Sparkle to query the Numisma dataset, and there are many example queries on the Numisma website, which you looked at. And so I want to just take that a little step further and look at the Snap data using Sparkle. Because that's the only way in which to do it. The first thing I want to show then is what the data looks like, and this is an important question because Sparkle, while it's a very powerful query language, it does require that you know what your data looks like in order to query it. Right? You can't say show me all the personal names in this database unless you know how personal names are encoded. You know whether there are personal names in the data or not, and this sort of thing. So the first thing you need to do is you need to have a look at the data and see what it looks like. And there are two ways to do that. One would simply be to look at the Snap cookbook, which tells you how to encode your data, but that would only show you how, in an ideal world, the data ought to look. And in fact, because not every data set or no data set will have all of the possible pieces of information that Snap asks for, then that still doesn't tell you what data is in the Snap data set. And the other way is to run a Sparkle query that says, show me all of the things that we know about a given person. So let's take one person record. This is a person identifier from the Lexicon with personal names, and a very simple Sparkle query which says, show me and it's two arbitrarily named variables, but these variables I've arbitrarily named them P and O to stand for predicate and object. And so I'm saying where this Lexicon Greek personal names identifier is the subject, and there is a predicate and there is an object. Show me all instances of that and show me the predicate and object in each case. That would give you a useful list in front of you, so you know all the things that have been said in RDF and how they have been said about a given randomly selected person from the data set, which is useful, and you can use that to start to do that. You would have to know what the LGPN identifier for a person is, and Snapdragon persons all have Snapdragon identifiers laid on top of the original source identifiers. So really what you want is you want to first know, I want to look for person number 650,000 in a Snapdragon data set and find that person. So we'll go to another Sparkle query here, which or in fact, I'm not looking for 650,000, I'm looking for 367,918 for some reason, but I've changed my example. I say, this is the Snapdragon URI for the person, this is the information we know, and you can take that information and put it in a web browser and you'll get some of this information back. And I want to know what is the, if I look for all the, if I simply did this with the Snapdragon identifier, it would only give me back one result, and it would say that this, the RDF triple where this identifier is defined. What I want instead is I want to know all of the things that are said about the original identifier, the LGPN identifier in the dataset. So what I want to say is which LGPN identifier, or which original database identifier, I may not even know that it's LGPN, is Snapdragon 367,918 derived from. And so this is the thing. So give me back the arbitrarily named variable. I called it orig because it means the originating identifier, where this snap identifier was derived from that. And you have to know that that's how we encode it in Snap, which is why I'm telling you this by giving you this this Sparkle snippet. But the other important thing I want to point out here is that this, as I think I mentioned the other day when we were talking about data formats, each of these three terms in the RDF triple is a full identifier, right? So this identifier, this uniform resource identifier for Snapdragon, it's a complete identifier, begins with HTTP. The result you get for orig will be, will in fact be this LGPN identifier that you see on the previous slide. And this thing in the middle, prov was derived from, is also a complete identifier. But it's only a complete identifier if you know what this prefix prov stands for. So for this to be complete, the query that you send to Sparkle has to include this prefix statement at the top there. Okay, so this makes it a little easier for us to type it down here. Otherwise, we would have to type http /www3 org/ns/prov hash was derived from as the second item in our triple. You could also do that, but once you start writing more complex Sparkle, it becomes much easier to use the prefixes and to declare the prefixes up the top. So this query then would return us the value of the originating URI of this, and we could then use the originating URI to do this query that we started with. Sparkle allows us to do slightly more complex queries than that, however, so we can then combine the two in a query here where we say return me all of the triples in the form original URI followed by predicate followed by object for this originating URI of which Snap 367 etc. was derived from. Okay, and so this is the third. This third query is the one that I would suggest you use. I've put this on the class outline page as it was one of the examples. There's two other examples on there as well, which we'll come to in a moment, for you to look at, and it will show you all of the triples in the Snapdragon triple store where this person is the first item of the first two, the left hand of the three triples, where it's the subject of an RDF statement, and what it will give you is something like this. It'll give you a bunch of triples, and it'll say this LGPN entry is RDF type person from the Lord ontology. This RDF entry is Dublin core terms, is part of the LGPN. This URI is Dublin core terms bibliographic citation, is 3A Eurydica 1. So this tells us that this is Lexicon Greek personal names, 3, a Eurydica 1. And so forth down the list. This is not terribly human readable, but it's useful for us to look at and see in each case the 3 items that you would get in the RDF triple for each statement. A slightly nicer way to represent this is using the turtle notation that we also introduced 3 weeks ago. And that's exactly the same information that you had on the previous slide. Simply in the results page from your Sparkle query. This is what the RDF underlying the Snapdragon information about one person looks like, and so this slide is something that I would sort of have in front of you when you're designing your queries, because you can then look at it and say, these are the sorts of things I will ask Sparkle to give me about these persons. The one other piece of information that we do have about this person is we know their SNAP identifier as well as their LGPN identifier, because we know that there is a triple which says SNAP 367918 was derived from this LGPN identifier, and the LGPN identifier has all this other information associated with it. This is the sort of thing that in a well-designed database you would never have to see as a user, okay? But because we're getting under the hood of a database, even when it is a well-designed database, there will sometimes be times when we want to get under the hood. In this case, it is not a well-designed database. There is no user interface whatsoever. We have to get under the hood in order to do this sort of query. So keep this slide with you when you go into the query. And I want to also, you might also want to keep with you the Snapdragon cookbook, and I've given you here the link to the in-progress version of the Snapdragon cookbook, because it's more up to date than the published version 1.0, which was published in 2014. So you might want to have this open as well to see what sorts of things are in the Snap data. And then if I quickly switch my screen share to share instead the web browser with the information about the exercise. So this is the page for this session. For the exercise, we want to suggest that you build on the queries that we've given you here and the practice you had with the Numisma Sparkle queries 3 weeks ago, and use this Sparkle interface that comes with the Snapdragon site. This is the only way of querying the Snapdragon site, as I say, and use some of these queries on it. So if you simply copy and paste this query that I gave you earlier, and this has person 1 in it, but you can use one of the other person records in there if you want to look at a different person, put this in here, press execute, and what it will do is it will download an XML file to your desktop, which you will have to open either in a text editor or in some XML editor, but a simple text editor will do. And that XML file will look something like that, that list of results I showed you that has results with 3 bindings in, which are the RDF queries. So I'll let you all try that out. The other thing I just wanted to very quickly show you are the 2 other example queries on here. I don't know how readable these are. I'm making them as big as possible while keeping them fitting on the screen. So this is the query 2. This is a query which will give you a list of the first 1,000, just to keep things simple. I think there are fewer than 1,000 anyway. Snap identifiers that are the merge of 2 deprecated identifiers, and it will also tell you the originating identifiers of those persons. So this query will say, so this is because when we have ingested a Lexicon Greek personal names entry for a person, and we've ingested a Trismegistos entry for a person, we've given those entries snap identifiers in addition. But then later we have unambiguously decided that these two records refer to the same person, and we've therefore given a new snap identifier for the person, and we've deprecated the two previous ones. We haven't deleted them, so they're still in there and they're still findable. And if you wanted to make the claim that they are not the same person, that they would be available for you to do so. But we've created a new identifier, and we expect for that new identifier to be the one that everyone uses to disambiguate their data. And this sparkle, which I'll leave you to go through and figure out how it works, will give you back the information of the new identifier, the two old identifiers that replaces, and the two original identifiers that those old identifiers are the snap representations of. And it will, and the rest of this is defining that query. And so try that out, see if you can work out what all those bits in between mean. Note that we've had here to define 4 different prefixes, because there are these prefixes that are used in here. I'm not sure why I've defined 4, because only 2 of them seem to be actually used in this query, but maybe while I was writing this query I wrote a longer one that had more. So have a look at this one. The third one I give is very similar, but instead of returning the originating, the old identifiers, the old snap identifiers and the original identifiers, it skips the old snap identifiers and it just brings you back the originating identifiers, the LGPN and PIR identifiers, and the names that those persons had. If those persons had names in the original data sets. And this will then give you back a bunch of data which you can look at. This will give you all instances in Snap where a new identifier has replaced 2 old identifiers, and what were the names of those 2 old identifiers, so that you can then look at them and you can say, okay, they look like they've got similar names, they probably are the same person. If you find one where the names are completely different, you might say Snap have made a mistake there, and have a look. So that's one thing you could do usefully with this data. What I wanted this to do is you to take these examples and use them to try and come up with new queries that you might ask of the Snap data set, and experiment with that and bring them to class next week, or whenever, if you're not in London, whenever your next class is, but my students, it's next week, and have a look at that, and we'll look at how Sparkle works and what that tells you about the data set, and to play with that. But I've gone on for much too long there, so I'll stop now.
Thanks, Gabby. Thanks, Rada. We're about an hour and 15 minutes in or so, which probably means that we ought to try to keep discussion and questions relatively short, relatively terse. I've checked on YouTube. I don't see any questions there. So I think burning questions in the group on the Hangout is probably where we should start.
Well, maybe I can start. Just one general note about these databases. And for example, as you know, I'm working on the fragments of the Greek historians, and in general in Leipzig we are OCRing many editions. And one problem we have is to disambiguate what we get. So for example, for Greek, I can mention for Greek. I'm experimenting with that with my collection of Greek historical fragments. I already have a huge list of proper names, but thanks to these databases, I can, for example, when I have inflected forms, I can get the lemma also for proper names, and then I can check, for example, in the LGPN or in Pleiades to see if a name is a personal name or a place name, automatically. And I'm already getting results. I'm going to publish these results. So the importance of these databases, this is just one example, of course, and why we need them. Of course, we still need a lot of data in the original language. Now I'm speaking for Greek, but it works. So this is what we need. And of course, we can add data manually, but well, we can't do that for everything, but it works. So for example, with my list, I get the lemma using Morpheus, and then I can check in the LGPN or in Pleiades, and I get results. Sometimes, for example, I have names that are both people and place names, this is interesting, or in other cases, I have to disambiguate. So this is just a general note about the importance of this extraordinary work.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to say, is that building this database, which is also searchable, or it's searchable by people who've gone through the pain of learning Sparkle, but when it's more generally searchable, that's only one of the outcomes of this sort of work. The most important part of this, I think, is that it's part of a much bigger project, where many things, including absolutely core in the middle of it, the Pleiades project, and the various people who've done work with that, but various other projects, including the tools at Perseus, the various tree banking that people have done, the various other kinds of disambiguation and lemmatizing and named entity extraction work that's been done around the world with various different aspects of classical material and other historical materials. And it's part of a massive work to really link together all aspects of data to create search tools, processing tools, exactly the sort of thing that you talk about, Monica, where you can be doing new work, and a lot of the disambiguation work is done for you by the existence of these existing tools. And Snap couldn't have done a quarter of what they did without the pre-existence of other tools, and of the theory work that had already been done by these other projects. But it also contributes to this, and that's part of the whole point. So people who are building onomastica, and people who are building lists of words and lists of place names and various other kinds of information and tools for extracting information and disambiguating information, all that, it's part of a massive networked, what Leif Saxon likes to call an ecosystem of work that couldn't exist in isolation.
Other questions? Comments? I don't think we have time to discuss it now, but I was struck by something that maybe we can take as a takeaway for discussion in classes and so on. Is there quite a lot of what we focused on were formats and tools and resources for structured data and working with structured data. And in many cases, our speakers problematized those, put them in the context of particular kinds of questions. And of course, a lot of the data that's structured in them represents the conclusions of research, the outcomes of research activities. But it seems to me that something that would be interesting to concentrate on in future conversations or follow-on discussions is the other half of prosopography as traditionally understood or methodologically understood. Prosopography on one level is building and using these kinds of reference tools, whether they're in codexes or whether they're structured data sets or even web applications that we can use to get at and manipulate structured data. So that's one half. The other half, though, is the actual business of trying to understand ancient people and trying to get under what they did, what they didn't do, why, what kinds of people did what, and what that tells us about society and cultural interaction and lots of other things, whether those are demographic concerns or sociological concerns or historical kind of causal concerns. And I think that kind of prosopography, which has especially been the province of the latter part of the 20th, the first part of the 21st century scholarship in ancient history, is an area that could do with more discussion on the length and level that we've had here about the reference works and how to build and use them. So anyway, I just leave that as an offering, not as a criticism, but as a opening for further discussion.
I think that's very important. Oh no, go ahead, Monica. Yeah.
I know, I wanted only to say that maybe we can define prosopography as structured onomastics, because in the end we have names in a structure and then we build a prosopography. So if we want a new definition, prosopography can be structured onomastics. And these tools are important to teach students and also for us to learn more about that.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, no, again, I agree we don't have time to discuss this in depth here, but that's an incredibly important point. When we're talking about digital classics, when we're talking about digital humanities, we very often gloss over the fact that what we're doing is trying to discover more about the ancient world. And we gloss over that because that's so obvious. We wouldn't be doing this if we weren't, almost, but we mustn't gloss over it in the sense, what do we learn by doing this sort of aggregated prosopography, the sort of aggregated geography that you guys do in Pleiades? What do we learn by doing this sort of massive aggregated philology that Open Greek and Latin are helping us do? What do we learn that we wouldn't know before? Are we just creating tools that other real scholars use to learn things, or are we scholars too? And I think the way I've phrased that makes it obvious that I want to say we're scholars too, right? Because we are learning about the ancient world. We wouldn't be doing this if we didn't care about the ancient world. If I didn't want to know more about people from the ancient world, I wouldn't have spent years of my life, writing funding bids, successful and unsuccessful, and putting all this effort into creating this aggregated prosopographical data set. And that's something we need to highlight and remind people of. I
think you're right on. One of the things I'm on about, as you know, from other context, is the business of starting to think about in more detail how we get computational agents to use these structured resources we're building, so that we're not just creating structured resources for humans, but we're putting automation and all that sort of thing at both ends of the scholarly communication pipeline, so that we can see what kinds of benefit can we get in the scholarly enterprise from not only having the structured data, but inferences against it. And that takes us into all those buzzword domains like machine learning and knowledge generation and so on. So anyway, good stuff.
I had a beautiful conversation which reminds us of that point as well, with some data scientists a few months ago maybe, and I wanted to show them the Snap data set, and I began, as I do with everyone, as I have done today, by apologizing that it's not very human readable. And being data scientists, they replied, "That's okay, we're not really human." Sparkle isn't their native language, right? So that wasn't a problem.
Well, on that note, we're an hour and a half in, so maybe we should wrap up today's session. Do I hear any final protests against bringing things to a close for the day? No protests. Very well. Thanks, everyone. We hope that everyone who watches this gets something out of it. And we'll see you again next week, or 2 weeks' time, depending on whether next week is a holiday for you. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Uncle.
Thank you.